The thinker who walked away from everything, Leo Tolstoy. What if the path to true wisdom begins the moment you abandon everything you once believed in? What if the life you've built, your comforts, your prestige, your very identity, is precisely what's keeping you from understanding the meaning of life? Leo Tolstoy wasn't just a literary genius. He was a man who walked away from wealth, fame, and even his own family in search of something deeper. At the height of his success, he felt an unbearable emptiness that no applause, no inheritance, no religion could fill. And so, he did the unthinkable. He renounced it all. His journey became one of the most radical transformations in modern history, a spiritual revolution that still whispers to those brave enough to question everything. If you've ever felt like your life was too full of noise and yet painfully hollow, if you've ever looked around and thought, there must be more than this, then this story is for you. Like and subscribe now, and activate the bell, because what you'll discover in Tolstoy's journey could shift the direction of your own. Topic 1: The crisis no one saw coming. Leo Tolstoy had everything a man of the 19th century could want: noble blood, international fame, a devoted wife, children, and the admiration of Europe's intellectual elite. Yet, in the quiet hours of his later years, an unshakable despair began to gnaw at him. He described it as a darkness that spread from the inside out, a realization that everything he had built was sitting atop a spiritual void. The applause had grown louder, but his soul had gone silent. He wrote in his diary that he was afraid of death, but even more afraid of living without meaning. He had conquered literature, with masterpieces like War and Peace and Anna Karenina, yet he confessed he didn't understand why he wrote them in the first place. What was the point of creating beauty if life itself felt like a lie? The world called him a genius, but inside he felt like a fraud, drifting in a sea of existential confusion. No one around him could sense the turmoil within. To others, he was still the great count, the towering novelist, the respected father and husband. But Tolstoy's smile had become a mask, and his success, a prison. He began to ask dangerous questions, the kind that society avoids. Why do we suffer? Why do we fear death? What is the purpose of my life? He feared he might go mad searching for answers. This was no fleeting melancholy. Tolstoy called it a spiritual illness. He considered suicide daily. At times, he would hide the rope in the barn, just in case. Even the faith of his childhood offered no relief. The rituals of the Orthodox Church felt hollow, mechanical, detached from real human suffering. He wasn't seeking religion. He was seeking truth, something raw, something unpolished, something that would grab him by the soul and shake him awake. He turned to science, philosophy, and theology. He read everything from Schopenhauer to Buddha. But the more he read, the deeper the pit became. No theory could explain the aching in his heart. He realized something terrifying. Intellect alone cannot save a dying soul. He needed a transformation, not a conclusion. And so, Tolstoy made the decision that would change everything. He stopped thinking and started searching. This crisis was not a breakdown. It was a breakthrough in disguise. It was the disintegration of an ego too large to hold the divine. When everything you rely on begins to crumble, it's not the end. It's the beginning of a higher kind of life. Tolstoy would later describe this as being born again, but not into a religion, into a new consciousness. He started to notice the simplicity of the peasants around him. Despite their suffering, they lived with a kind of peace that eluded the upper class. He saw something in their eyes: acceptance, endurance, and faith, not in dogma, but in the act of living itself. They worked, suffered, prayed, and smiled without needing to understand the cosmos. Their quiet strength awakened something in him. Could it be that the answers he sought weren't hidden in books, but in the lives of the poor and forgotten? Was it possible that the people considered simple were actually living closer to the truth? Tolstoy began to question every social structure he once upheld: education, aristocracy, property, even family. Nothing was sacred anymore, except perhaps one thing, the inner voice he had ignored for decades. That voice, faint at first, told him to let go. Let go of the applause. Let go of the mansions. Let go of being Leo Tolstoy. And that terrified him. Because who are you if you give up the role you've played your entire life? Who are you when the world no longer claps? This wasn't just about faith or philosophy, it was about identity. Tolstoy realized that to be reborn, one must first die, not physically, but symbolically. The ego must collapse, the pride must dissolve, and for a man who had shaped culture itself, this was the hardest surrender of all. He started to live more simply, to dress like a peasant, to eat less, to give more. He no longer wanted to be someone, he wanted to feel something real. He wanted his actions to align with truth, not image. He began to write not for the public, but for the soul. And the world turned on him for it. His family was alarmed. His wife Sophia felt betrayed, as if her husband had abandoned her for an invisible lover, truth. The literary elite mocked him. Religious authorities excommunicated him. But none of it mattered anymore. Tolstoy had found something purer than reputation. He had found integrity. And yet, he was still human. He still wrestled with pride, guilt, and temptation. His letters show that even in his quest for simplicity, his ego would whisper in his ear. But the difference was this: he no longer let it drive him. He saw the ego for what it was, a clever mask, not the face of the soul. His crisis had done something radical. It had made him honest. And once a man becomes honest with himself, he becomes dangerous to every illusion society holds dear. This is the Tolstoy who walked away, not out of hatred for the world, but out of deep love for truth. A truth that demanded everything. And now I ask you, have you ever had a moment when everything felt meaningless, despite having all the right things? Comment below. Your story might help someone else wake up too. Topic 2: The Great Renunciation. Walking into the unknown. Imagine reaching the peak of worldly success, only to walk away. Not because you lost it, but because you realized it was never real. That's exactly what Tolstoy did. He didn't go bankrupt. He didn't fall from grace. He chose to walk away. Voluntarily. Not just from wealth, but from an entire identity built over decades. He gave up his copyrights. He began dressing like a laborer. He stopped eating meat, refused to carry money, and gave his lands away. To the world, it looked like madness, but to Tolstoy it was liberation. Every possession, every title, every comfort was a shackle, and he was cutting them off one by one. His renunciation wasn't performative, it was existential. He wanted to strip away everything that separated him from the truth. And the truth, he believed, could only be found when nothing was left to hide behind. Not language, not logic, not luxury. Just presence. Just being. The house that once rang with laughter now echoed with confusion and sorrow. His children couldn't understand what had taken hold of their father. His wife, once his greatest companion, now felt abandoned and enraged. She begged him to return to the life they knew. But Tolstoy had already crossed a threshold. He could never go back. And the irony? He still loved them, fiercely. But he had discovered a deeper form of love, one that demanded solitude, not attachment. He wasn't rejecting them out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Like a monk entering the desert, Tolstoy needed the silence to hear something greater. He wrote a confession, a brutally honest account of his spiritual breakdown and rebirth. In it, he admits his fears, his contradictions, his doubts. He dismantles his former self with scalpel-like precision. No excuses, no pride, just raw truth. And that book shook the foundations of the literary world. People didn't know how to respond. Some called him a saint, others a lunatic. But what disturbed them most wasn't his actions. It was that his questions made sense. They touched a nerve society had tried to numb. What if he was right? What if the life we chase is a carefully orchestrated distraction? Tolstoy began to live like the peasants around him, not out of pity, but out of admiration. He worked with his hands. He wore simple clothes. He found beauty in labor, in stillness, in silence. He became a mirror to a world addicted to noise and ambition. He rejected violence, war, and institutionalized religion. He denounced nationalism and advocated for universal love. He believed that no man had the right to kill another, not for country, not for God, not even for justice. It was a radical stance, and it inspired generations, from Gandhi to Martin Luther King Jr. But don't mistake him for a peaceful sage. Tolstoy was intense, conflicted, and often torn by inner storms. His letters reveal a man who doubted himself, who wept often, who longed for connection and yet craved solitude. He wasn't perfect, but he was awake. He didn't want followers. He wanted seekers, people who would dare to question everything, even him. He warned against turning him into a prophet. His message was simple: the truth is inside you, but you must lose everything to find it. Even your idea of yourself. The more he walked away, the more the world tried to pull him back. Critics wanted his next novel. Clergy wanted his repentance. Family wanted his return. But Tolstoy no longer belonged to any of them. He had become a pilgrim of the soul. He wandered through forests, slept in huts, prayed alone. Not to escape, but to listen, to the earth, to silence, to God. And slowly something shifted. He began to experience moments of deep peace, not happiness, but serenity, the kind that doesn't need a reason to exist. He once said, "Everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself." That was his gospel. Not a new religion, but a new attunement to life. A life where every act is sacred, every breath a prayer, every human a mirror. By the end of his life, Tolstoy had become a paradox, revered and reviled, saint and outcast, genius and madman. But perhaps that's what happens when you stop living by the world's rules. You stop fitting in, and you start becoming real. So I'll ask you this: if you had to lose everything to find yourself, would you have the courage to walk away? Topic 3 of The War Within: Ego, Faith, and the Silent Battle. Even after renouncing everything, Tolstoy was not at peace. The battlefield had simply shifted from the outer world to his inner world. And there, the war raged with greater violence. The ego, wounded but not dead, fought back. It whispered that he was special, a prophet, a savior. It used even his spirituality as bait. He would meditate in silence, only to be interrupted by the thought of being admired for meditating. He would write humbly, then crave recognition for his humility. It was a maddening paradox. The very act of doing good risked becoming a new form of pride. And Tolstoy knew it. He documented these torments with brutal honesty. Few thinkers dared to expose the spiritual traps that come after enlightenment. Most hide behind their teachings. Tolstoy did the opposite. He tore his own ideas apart. He feared becoming a false god in the eyes of others. He feared becoming another illusion. His journals became sacred ground, filled with confessions, cries, and insights. They show a man fighting daily to remain true, to not fall back into ego's games. Every step forward felt like a temptation to fall. And yet, he pressed on. Because truth, once glimpsed, cannot be ignored. He became obsessed with the teachings of Jesus, not the church's version, but the raw words of the Sermon on the Mount. He saw in them a call to radical love, non-violence, and inner purity. To him, this was not religion. It was reality. But the church called him heretic, and his rejection of its authority only grew stronger. He saw how institutions use God as a mask for power. He wanted to return to a faith with no temples, no priests, only compassion. He stripped Christianity to its essence. Love your neighbor, forgive endlessly, resist not evil. He started preaching a life of non-resistance, where evil is not fought with violence, but dissolved through understanding. He saw war as collective madness. He refused to support the military or the state. And this, in a Russia obsessed with empire, made him a threat. Censors banned his writings. Secret police monitored his movement. Yet Tolstoy was not afraid. He had already died to the world. What more could they take from him? His only fear now was falling back into illusion, into ego, into comfort disguised as virtue. He saw clearly how power corrupts not just the rulers, but the revolutionaries. He warned that even noble causes become monstrous if rooted in hatred. His was a quiet rebellion, a revolution of conscience, not of guns, and that made him infinitely more dangerous. His spiritual war was not about achieving enlightenment. It was about staying awake in a world that sleeps. Every morning, he asked himself, am I serving truth or serving myself? And most days, he wasn't sure. But the honesty of the question kept him human. He didn't try to be perfect. He tried to be real. He admitted failure. He admitted doubt. He didn't preach from a mountaintop. He wrote from the trenches of the soul. And people listened, not because he had answers, but because he had the courage to stay in the questions. This made his legacy strange. He wasn't a saint, a leader, or a prophet. He was a man who got lost and kept walking. A man who refused to lie to himself. A man who turned his back on applause to hear a quieter voice within. He never fully escaped his contradictions. He still had property. He still clashed with his wife. He still struggled. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the path to truth is not a clean break, but a continuous tearing away of illusion. He wrote that the greatest danger is believing you've arrived. The moment you feel enlightened is the moment you stop growing. He saw enlightenment not as a state, but as a practice, a daily discipline of self-inquiry and surrender. He began to see beauty in suffering, not as punishment but as purification. Pain, when faced with open eyes, burned away the ego. It made you soft enough to feel, humble enough to listen, strong enough to love without needing anything in return. This was the Tolstoy few knew, the man who wept for strangers, who fasted for clarity, who wandered the woods in search of silence. Not a philosopher of ideas, but of being. Not a teacher of systems, but of sincerity. He believed that if you sit in silence long enough, everything false within you will rise, and beg to be released. That's why solitude is terrifying, because it forces you to meet yourself. And meeting yourself is the beginning of everything. So let me ask you this. What are you still clinging to, afraid to lose, even though it might be the very thing blocking your awakening? Topic 4: Influence Beyond Death. The Seeds of Quiet Revolution. Tolstoy never intended to become a spiritual icon, but his words, raw and unfiltered, planted seeds across the globe. Long after his death, those seeds bloomed in unexpected places, in the minds of rebels, mystics, and visionaries who would go on to shape the 20th century. Mahatma Gandhi credited Tolstoy as one of his greatest inspirations. The two exchanged letters, and though they never met, Tolstoy's doctrine of nonviolence helped shape the heart of Gandhi's revolution. A Russian aristocrat whispering truth to an Indian revolutionary, across oceans, cultures, and religions. Martin Luther King Jr. also found power in Tolstoy's ethics of love and resistance. The idea that real power comes not from domination, but from sacrifice, from refusing to become what you fight against, from the courage to absorb violence without returning it. This is the paradox Tolstoy revealed. True revolution doesn't come from anger, but from purity of heart, from living as if the kingdom of truth already exists, and refusing to participate in lies, even when it costs you everything. His ideas challenged governments, churches, and intellectuals. He wasn't left or right. He was something deeper, a soul trying to heal. He didn't fight for an ideology. He fought for the invisible dignity of every human being. And yet, he remained an outsider. Russia, afraid of his influence, buried his writings. Schools taught his novels but ignored his transformation. They praised war and peace but censored a confession. They wanted the genius, not the awakened man. But the awakened man is the one who matters, because his words continue to echo in hearts across the world. They bypass institutions and speak directly to the soul. They don't ask for followers. They ask for awakening. Tolstoy died in a train station, alone and sick, having fled his estate one final time. Some say he was escaping his family. Others say he was seeking silence. But perhaps in that cold moment, he was finally at peace. No titles, no applause, just breath, just being. His funeral drew massive crowds, not because of how he died, but because of how he lived. He reminded the world that greatness is not measured by achievement, but by authenticity, by the willingness to lose everything false to find what is real. Today, his writings remain alive, not because they entertain, but because they provoke. They challenge you to look inward, to question your comforts, to dismantle your borrowed belief, to walk your own path. In a time of noise, he chose silence. In a culture of power, he chose surrender. In a world of appearances, he chose truth. And that's why he still speaks. Not in words, but in the quiet tug you feel when you know you're not living your truth. He didn't leave us a map. He left us a mirror. And mirrors are dangerous. They show us not who we pretend to be, but who we are. And who we could be if we dared to let go. His influence endures not as doctrine, but as presence. In every act of radical honesty. In every soul brave enough to walk away from the fake and into the fire of truth. So the question is no longer, what did Tolstoy teach? The question is, what are you going to do with the mirror he handed you? Topic 5, The Invitation. What Tolstoy still asks of us. Tolstoy's life wasn't just a story, it was a provocation. A challenge hurled through time. Not to admire him, but to examine ourselves. Because if someone with everything can walk away for the sake of truth, what excuse do we have? We live in a world that rewards distraction, that pays you to forget yourself, that numbs you with pleasure, performance, and praise. And if you're not careful, you'll wake up one day successful, admired, and completely lost. Just like Tolstoy. But here's the hope. It's never too late to start walking away. Not from your responsibilities, but from your illusions. From the roles you perform to be loved. From the fears you protect to feel safe. From the masks you wear to be seen. You don't need to renounce everything. But you do need to question everything. Every belief, every habit, every thought you've inherited. Not out of rebellion, but out of devotion to truth. Because you cannot serve two masters, comfort and freedom. Tolstoy's invitation is simple. Sit in silence. Listen. And when the inner voice speaks, don't ignore it. It will be inconvenient. It will threaten your image. But it will save your soul. That's where it begins, with honesty. Brutal, liberating honesty. The kind that makes you tremble. The kind that makes you weep. The kind that breaks the illusion that you are what the world told you to be. And once you taste that kind of truth, you can't go back. You'll begin to see the lies in your own life, the relationships built on fear, the work done without meaning, the distractions used to avoid pain. And you'll have a choice. Tolstoy's legacy is not a path to follow. It's a fire to walk through, a purification, a stripping away, not to become someone else, but to return to who you were before the world told you to forget. He doesn't ask you to copy him. He asks you to become radically yourself, to make your own confession, to find your own surrender, to discover what you must walk away from. It might be an addiction, a belief, a relationship, a job, or simply the voice that says, "You're not enough." Whatever it is, let it die. Because something more beautiful is waiting to be born. And when it does, you'll know. Not because life will be easy, but because it will be real. And real life, unfiltered, unmasked, unafraid, is the rarest form of freedom. So this is the invitation. Don't worship Tolstoy. Embody what he dared to live. Start small. Tell the truth today. Sit in silence for 5 minutes. Question your next desire. Feel your next breath as sacred. And when the time comes, walk away. Walk away from what dims your soul. Walk toward what sets it ablaze. You may lose the world, but you'll find yourself, and that, dear seeker, is the greatest story ever written. Now I ask you, with your whole heart, what must you walk away from, to finally come home to who you really are? Walk away from illusion, return to the real. Leo Tolstoy's journey wasn't about escape, it was about return. A return to truth, to presence, to the silent fire of the soul. He showed us that no amount of success, fame, or love from the world can replace the quiet knowing that you are living in alignment with your essence. His crisis became a portal, his renunciation a rebirth, and his legacy a sacred mirror. Through his writings, his silence, and his walk into the unknown, Tolstoy reminds us that freedom doesn't come when we gain more, but when we let go of what never belonged to us. We saw how even the greatest minds can be haunted by emptiness, how the ego survives in the shadows of our virtues, how true spiritual revolution begins not with shouting, but with surrender. Tolstoy's war was never against the world, it was against the illusions within himself. And that's what made him dangerous. That's what made him free. In a society obsessed with performance, he chose authenticity. In a world built on noise, he chose the raw stillness of being. And in doing so, he left behind a trail of light for those brave enough to follow. So I leave you with this. What if the next chapter of your life doesn't require more effort, but more honesty? What if your transformation begins the moment you stop pretending? Like this video if it touched something deep inside you. Subscribe and activate the bell if you want more content that speaks to your soul, not your ego. And share this with someone who is ready to walk away, not from life, but from illusion. Because the world doesn't need more followers. It needs more seekers. And your time is now.